squash. Pumpkins, heirloom squash, all of those kind of delicious and nutritious things that decorate our homes and brighten up the autumn season. Where the squash ranch is located is kind of what used to be a dead space in the garden for many years. This is the side of a building that has a gravel French drain. Let's take a look at that French drain. So see, it's a gravel French drain here on the side of a building. This used to be a kind of dead space for a long time. There was just gravel and invasive plants here. But one day I had the bright idea to introduce squash in pots. Winter squash generally do best when grown directly in the ground where they can spread their roots. But winter squash can also grow if provided with large pots filled with richly fertilized soil. Let me show you some examples of some of the winter squash that I am growing in the squash ranch. This one here is a Brazilian pumpkin. So this is a beautiful Brazilian pumpkin here. Look at that. So this one is almost mature, but its skin is still a little soft. So we're going to let it stay on the vine until its skin hardens up and the rest of the plant dies off. So Brazilian pumpkin, Cucurbita maxima. Another example of a squash, I'd like to show you one of our squashes, which of course start out as flowers. This is a male flower with pollen only, but this is how our squashes usually look when they are very young. So see, this is a young pumpkin here. So almost all of our squashes start out as these green, kind of stripy, small fruits, and then as the squash adds water to the cells, they pump up and become huge. Once a squash is pumped up and become huge, then the squash skin starts to harden, which forms the hard shell of the squash that lets it last all winter. I see a couple of squash that are nearly ready to harvest, but we're going to wait until the plants die off at the end of the summer. This is a crown prince squash. We can tell it's a crown prince squash due to its bluish silvery skin. Over here, we have a very unusual squash called a Cushaw squash. This one is still just a baby, but it already looks very different from other squash in my garden. Wouldn't you agree with this variegated coloring? This is a type of indigenous squash from Mesoamerica called a Cushaw squash. And this is a green striped Cushaw. It's actually a different species than most of our other winter squashes. If you want to grow squash in pots in a kind of dead space in your garden, such as one of these gravel French drains, I recommend using these very large buckets and pots. You can also use buckets with holes drilled in the bottom for drainage, but they must be filled with good quality garden compost and lots of fertilizer such as bloodfish and bone meal and chicken manure. I recommend watering the squash in the squash ranch approximately twice a week to make sure that they're well hydrated, because when squash are grown in containers like this, drying out is a big problem for them. Let's take a look at some of the other interesting types of squash in the squash ranch. So as you can see, the squash vines grow along the gravel area. The gravel area helps keep the squash clean, and it's also not a very welcoming environment for pests like slugs to crawl over. So growing them on gravel is almost like growing them on the weed suppressant cloth in my traditional squash garden. Oh my gosh, here's one of my very favorite squashes. This is a candy roaster squash. This is a Native American variety of squash grown by the Cherokee people of North America. This is more typical of many heirloom Native American squashes to be kind of banana or rod shaped, whereas a lot of European cultivars tend to be more round and multicolored and a bit more ornamental. However, the flavor of this squash is second to none. It tastes like pumpkin pie naturally, with all the delicious maple syrupy sweetness and spiciness. Truly a wonderful squash for both savory and sweet dishes. Over here, we have some Indian summer squash. Now, when I say Indian, I don't mean Native American. I mean South Asian, of course. Now, I'm just experimenting by letting these little guys turn into winter squash. It's true that most types of summer squash will turn into winter squash if allowed to develop the hard shells. So I'm going to see how these guys fare as winter squash. And over here, we have the charming Japanese uchiki kuri squash. You can tell it's an uchiki kuri squash because of its cute teardrop shape and distinctive reddish-orange color. Really a cute squash. I hope this vine will make a few more of them. Thank you so much for joining me on this tour of the squash ranch. I hope that seeing this squash ranch will inspire you to use underutilized spaces in your garden to grow these high-value, delicious, and beautiful plants. Thank you so much for joining me, and stay curious about plants, everyone.